Howdy, and welcome to the Pagan Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Janet Callahan. I'm the author of Parenting Pagan Tots and 2 workbooks on children's programming, one that is specifically about working with disabled and neurodivergent children in pagan programming. You can find those on Amazon and on Kindle. I also write the mother column for Sage Woman magazine, and I run a group that's pretty eclectic called Spiral Moon Family Circle. I'm also the mom to 2 children, currently 12 and 15, who are disabled. On this podcast, we talk about all things pagan parenting. This week on the podcast, we are going to talk about a question from a listener. Their question is about raising a child in a household where one parent is pagan and the other parent is not. So let's actually back up a step first. Lots of us came into paganism, Wicca, Druidism, whatever, as converts. Lots and lots of us. When I was a new pagan back in the 90s, the idea that there would be kids who were raised pagan was still sort of baffling to us. We saw people there at events with kids, but most of them were younger kids, honestly, not too many teenagers. And we didn't know anybody who was really raising their kid pagan with the intention of them growing up to be pagan. And here we are 30 years later, and the landscape is dramatically different. There are quite a few, actually, adults who were raised in pagan households who are practicing pagans. Jason Mankey presents at Convocation here in Metro Detroit at most years, and Jason is actually a really good example, right? Jason grew up in the same area that I did as a kid. He's a little bit younger than me, but he was raised in a family that was practicing pagan, that went to all the big events there in St. Louis, and he is, a well-known author and personality in our community. There are tons and tons of people now, and the idea that it would happen is not that unusual anymore. Even Convocation, I think, is going to be their 30th year next year, and there are adults there who went to Convocation as children. So, I think that's going to shift the dynamics of this a little bit, but let's go back and think about it from the perspective of someone who converted at some point and now has married somebody who is of another faith. I think, though, we should even step back a few steps further first. Let's assume you and your spouse are pagan, and you are raising your child in your household that is a pagan household. That's what I tell people a lot. My kids go to pagan things and participate in pagan rituals because that's what we do. We're not making up special rituals just for them. We're just living our lives as pagans, and that's their experience. It's not about forcing them to believe one thing or another. It's just, this is what we're doing as a family, right? We have a lot of relatives who are not pagan, as one might expect. Most of them are Lutheran or Catholic or Episcopalian. But there are a few who are Seventh-day Adventist, and there are a few who are more charismatic Christians, and a few other things too. And I look at it sort of in rings of exposure. We have a ton of relatives who are out there on the outer edges. We see them at funerals, we see them at weddings, we see them maybe every couple of years at some family gathering. And frankly, we don't see them enough for vast quantities of our lives to be things they know about. And so for the most part, we just don't talk about it with them. It's really none of their business. But also, we don't really know them that well. And they don't know the kids that well. And it's just not, we're not sharing tons of details about the kids in general with them because they're just not that much closer than random strangers, right? And any of them who have discovered our faith and have said anything about it, we typically are just like, you know what, we're not discussing that here. That next ring is the people you see several times a year. For us, that is some of our cousins that we didn't grow up with. It's many of our aunts and uncles, and people like that. Questions come up once in a while, and our take has always been to sort of say, oh, well, we don't do that here, right? We don't go into specifics because we're, again, only going to see them a couple times a year. And if it really has to be answered, the answer is usually something along the lines of, we have our own faith, and we have our own faith community, and the kids are just fine. And we sort of leave it at that. Most of the time, that heads off most of the discussion. For people that we would get into a deeper discussion with, I would pick and choose. I would pick people that you have a solid relationship with, that have a history of being respectful to things you've done over the years that were not maybe what they would have done. And I think it's important to remember that you don't have to justify your beliefs to anybody. Nobody else would justify their faith or their belief under the same circumstances. And just because our beliefs are not quite as mainstream as some others doesn't mean that we are required to be more detailed and specific and to prove that we have the right answers. Nobody has the right answers. So then there's the family members that you see pretty regularly, right? This is, at least for us, like my in-laws who live in the same metro area. It's people like my mom who we talk to pretty regularly. It's family members that live close by. When I lived in a small town, it would have been a much wider circle of people, right? As a kid, I lived in a small town with like 1,500 people. So all of my dad's aunts and uncles lived within 10 minutes of our house. You ran into people at the grocery store. You ran into people at any store in town. You ran into them at school events, at football games. I laugh a little bit, but you ran into them at the bar after work, which I had been to most of the bars in that town by the time I was 10, because we were often stopping at bars on my dad's way home from work looking for relatives. So, in those cases, it is less likely that it's going to be unknown that you have religious beliefs that do not match theirs, right? In a small town like that, everybody knows everything about everybody. And so then it comes to a couple of things, right? One of them is, do you like this person enough to care what their opinion is? And one of them is, are they capable of having a respectful conversation about it? And I'm just going to lay it out that my take is, if they can't be respectful about it, then you don't need to be having a conversation with them about it. This is where boundaries come in, right? There's a lady on TikTok who has TikToks about gentle parenting an uncle at a family gathering or somebody at a bar or, whatever. And some of her takes are really the way I would take this. Like, oh, yes, we have another religion. We follow a different belief. Everybody's entitled to their beliefs. That's fine. That's really rude for you to say that. I'm not going to discuss that with you. So what you would do is you would pick your boundary, right? Is the boundary, you can ask questions, but as soon as you're rude about it, we're going to stop? Is the boundary that this person has a history of being inappropriate, and so you're just not going to talk about it? And be prepared to follow through, right? Boundaries are hard when people aren't expecting you to follow through. They want the boundary, they see the boundary as a challenge. What can I do to make you stop enforcing your boundary? And so when you first put that boundary out there, it's going to be really hard because they're going to try and talk over it and get around it over and over and over again. And you just have to be a broken record and come back to it every time. I'm sorry, we're not discussing that. I'm sorry, this is our belief, and that's not up for debate. I'm sorry, I'm the parent, and I am raising my child the way I see to be in their best interest. You had your kids, and you parented them the way you wanted to parent them. This child is not your child. They're my child, and I get to make those decisions. Obviously, for people who are more capable of having a respectful conversation, you can have a different conversation. You can talk about what you see as useful or beneficial. You can talk about what good things you find in your religion, or how the previous religion didn't work for you, or whatever. I know one of the questions my mom asked when we started sort of telling everybody that, like, when I started saying, okay, well, I'm not really Christian, one of the questions my mom asked was like, well, do you still believe that it's bad to murder people? Well, yeah, of course. Do you still believe XYZ? And like, a lot of those questions were very basic questions, but they were about real fears that she had about what this change in belief meant, because she wasn't familiar with my new faith. Over time, my mom has actually been one of our biggest champions here. Now, to be really, really clear, my mom's family is indigenous. We're Oglala Lakota. And so she has a lot of family members that follow traditional beliefs, but most of them are also still Catholic. So her introduction to this was a little easier than some people's. But when my oldest child was born, he was born 13 weeks early, and he was super, super tiny and super, super sick. And I was also very sick. And my in-laws came to see him. They actually saw him before I did, because I was not well enough to leave to go to the NICU to check in on him. And so everything I heard was secondhand. But my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my mother-in-law's mother were all there to see him. And they were honestly just over the top, because they had no experience with anything like this. Also, they were sure he was going to be a girl, and so that was really, a challenge for them to make that leap. But anyway, In the waiting room of the NICU, as my husband was checking in and making sure that they could come in and see Alex, my husband's grandmother asked what we were doing about baptizing him, because clearly he needed to be baptized in case he didn't live. And my mom spun around and she was like, "This baby is not dying. This baby does not need to be baptized today because he is not going to die." And I guess that shut it up for a while, because we never heard a question about baptism again. Grandma was old enough at that point that we had, talked a little bit about not being Lutheran and not being Catholic. But like in her mind, there weren't any really other choices. Her dear cousin was Seventh-day Adventist, and so she knew there were other religions out there. But the idea that there were other religions that weren't Christian was really hard for her, first of all. And second of all, like, it just didn't click. And so we just mostly didn't have that discussion. Same thing with my dad. My dad was always very big on ignoring things that didn't match his worldview. And so I told him I didn't go to church and that I was exploring other religions, but in his mind there wasn't any other religion to explore. The idea that I would change religion was so utterly baffling that he was just like, "Oh, well, you must be an atheist then." So, the biggest thing though is communication, right? All relationships take communication to be good relationships. And communicating things like boundaries, like, we are not celebrating this holiday. We are not baptizing this child. We are not sending this child to religious school. We are not doing this. In our house, we celebrate these holidays. In our house, we do XYZ. And just leave it very simple, declarative statements. We are doing X, period. If they are not willing to accept those boundaries, I know one that comes up fairly often in pagan parenting groups is the baptism thing. Look, if they're threatening to take your kids to be baptized without your permission, then they don't need to be around your kids without supervision, right? And I know that's hard, particularly when it's a grandparent and you're hopeful that they will help with childcare, but this is a boundary you're setting, and if they're not willing to hold this boundary, which they claim doesn't matter that much, right, because they're not hurting your kid, what other boundaries are they going to ignore? What other ways are they going to ignore your request for your child and potentially put your child at risk if they can't follow this specific, simple request? It's not that hard. They have to go out of their way to make an appointment to have a child baptized. And if they're going to do all of that effort, then they are not a safe person for your child to be around. All right, let's take a little break. After the break, we'll come back and talk about what we do when it's in our own household. Did you know that you can support the Pagan Parenting Podcast? It's really easy. Just go to paganparentingpodcast.com and click on the support link. You can donate directly to support this podcast. If you like what you hear, we'd love to have your support. We're also always interested in advertisers, both here and on our websites. We can advertise for your business here on the podcast, on Spiral Moon TV, Pagan Public Radio, Semaphore News broadcasts, and at our events. Contact me directly, publishing@spiralmoon.net. All right, so let's talk about what happens when it's somebody who's part of your daily life. I am going to use some shorthand terms here, and I want to define them before we get too far, just so you are really clear on what I mean, because I don't want to have to re-explain the thought process every time that we talk about a different part of this. So I'm going to use the word household here. And by household, I mean those people that you interact on a daily or nearly daily basis with, who are part of your extended family, whether that is by blood or by choice. My family is polyamorous. Some of us live in one house and some of us live in a separate house, but we are together nearly every day. We eat meals together. We share childcare duties. We share a number of other things. Their house happens to be literally across the street. That was a purposeful choice. And so some decisions are made by household simply because there are two separate spaces to deal with. But some decisions are made as a group. Like we share Google Family Plan for YouTube and YouTube Music, right? Because it's cheaper to put all of us on one account. We pay our electric bills and our water bills separately because it's two separate residences. All right, I'm going to use the word partner. And you can take that to mean as many partners as you see fit. I'm also going to include things in this like families who live near other relatives who you spend a ton of time with. For example, when I was a kid, we lived just down the road from my grandparents. It was about 2 miles, and we saw them every day. We lived in a small town. Grandma and grandpa were the backup. Like if something went wrong at home when mom and dad were at work, we called grandma and grandpa because grandma and grandpa were always home and grandma and grandpa were always there to come bail us out or to randomly happen to be in town on a snowy day when we were walking someplace after school, like to religion class or to whatever, and grandpa would happen to be in town and pick us up so we didn't have to walk in the snow, right? Again, separate households, but lots of group decisions and lots of group interaction on a daily or nearly daily basis. And I'm going to include all of those because I think they all sort of run together, right? So the first thing is you have to communicate with people. And I know that's not always easy. But one of the things I learned living in a small town is that if you're not communicating with the people that you're spending all of that time with, people make a lot of assumptions, and you really have to be explicit in your intention and your meaning, or the default, whatever they have done in the past, is going to be the rule of the land. So if you are spending a lot of time, for example, with your kids' grandparents, and you are not intending to raise your children in your kids' grandparents' faith, then you are going to have a discussion about that. And that can be really hard, right? A lot of us have the experience of being terrified of the consequences of that discussion. And if you're afraid of the consequences of that discussion, then there's no possible way for you to actually have that existence in that relationship, right? You cannot be afraid of telling them, no, we're not taking the kids to church, or no, we're going to celebrate this holiday instead or in addition to. you can't have that celebration if you can't tell people that you're having the celebration. Especially if they're people you spend a ton of time with. Remember that kids do not always have the same filters that adults have. And while it is complicated but doable to keep things like that a secret when you're an adult, it is really not going to work with kids. I feel like most relationships need more conversation in general. Because we all sort of make these assumptions about what the default is and what everyone else is going to do in a given situation. And it just doesn't work that way. So talk, and talk some more. If you tell your spouse or your partner or your parents that this is how you're raising your kids or how you want to raise your kids, and you can't come to some negotiation of what they want to do as well, then you're going to have a bad time, right? Living with other people almost always comes with compromises. And if you can't figure out how to make those compromises now, it's not going to get better. It's not going to get easier over time. You're going to keep coming back to those same sorts of issues. And it's going to be a long, hard slog, right? So that's the first thing. In fact, I would say you need to be having that discussion way up front, way before you have children. That's why most Christian churches require some sort of premarital counseling, because they too have found that asking people to at least have those conversations or at least start those conversations helps them in the long run, because they're not going into something where everybody assumes they're on the same page, but they're not. So I think that's the first part of it, right? You have to have had the conversation, especially because in most states, while religion isn't supposed to be used against you if there is a split between the parents of a child, they also are not going to generally say, well, you can't tell the other parent not to take their kids to their house of worship. So, that's the reality of it. You're going to have to figure it out, because even if you later split up, you're still going to have to figure it out, and then you're going to have to figure it out with somebody you don't even like. I think the discussion, when the other person is definitely not on the same page, or at least definitely not the same religion, has to start out with, I don't want to block our children from your experience, right? You're not trying to take children away from that part of the rest of their family's life. I mean, unless maybe you are, but if you are, then you need to be having a bigger discussion about how that life together actually works, I guess, is what I'm getting at. So if you and the other biological parent are on different religious wavelengths, then you need to talk about how you're going to do that. Are you going to celebrate all the holidays? Are you going to celebrate some of yours and some of theirs? Are you going to, what are you going to do if a child says, no, don't want to do that? No, I don't want to go to church this week. No, I don't want to go to this festival for the weekend. No, I don't want to whatever, right? Because that eventually happens in many cases, right? It happens even when families are all part of the same faith. Teenagers are teenagers. So you need to talk about things like what choices does the child have? What autonomy does the child have in this situation? When do we give them autonomy? How do we give them autonomy? And what things really matter to the parents? And that's the other part of it. What do you find to be most important? Is the most important thing having some sort of daily or weekly spiritual or religious practice? Is the most important thing learning about everyone's practices? Is the most important thing um, building family traditions? I always feel like that should be probably one of the biggest things, because those are the things kids care about, and those are the things kids remember long into adulthood, is what they did as a family, um, at various holidays and events. Those family memories are the things that, when we look back, are the things that are often most important to us. And so those are the things I would focus on. If there's something that is really, really, really key for you, then that's the thing that you have to prioritize, right? If you are really keen on your kids having this great experience of Santa to look back on, then you and your partner need to figure that out. Like, are they on board with having Santa as a thing? How are you going to do Santa if your experiences are completely different? Um, that actually, I think, is one of the hardest parts of being in a relationship with someone where you're sharing space with them, even without kids. Um, you have your expectations of what various holidays are like based on your history, and they have their expectation, and those expectations are almost never going to be the same. And so, talking through, what do we do on Christmas Eve? What do we do on Christmas Day? If you've always gone to a certain relative's house and they've always done something completely different, what's the plan? Who is going to budge on their plan changing? Um, we had, before we had kids, because we had kids sort of late into our relationship, we had been married 8 years by then. Um, we alternated holidays with families. One holiday we would spend here with my spouse's family, and the next holiday we would go back to my house, my parents. Um, and that caused some heartburn for all of the parents, right? Because they were used to us being home for every holiday. When we had kids, we started talking about what things were we going to change, because what things were we going to do that were our traditions, not the traditions we had grown up with. Um, and then our kids were complicated, and traveling every week, every holiday got to be really just too hard. And we spent a ton of holidays in the hospital, and like, it just sort of reset everything. But I think for a lot of families, that's where that reset happens. That's where families, where people start building their own traditions with their own household, as opposed to continuing to do the things that they grew up with. Um, because sometimes it just doesn't make sense, right? One of the ones that didn't make sense here was that everybody wanted the kids to sit down and open every present in like 10 minutes. Like, let's just get through them all so we can take pictures of everybody opening the presents and it'll all be awesome and fun and. But you know what? It wasn't fun for the kids. My kids get overwhelmed pretty easily, and opening all of the presents in one go is really hard for them because they want to sit and play with whatever the thing is that they just opened. They don't actually want to open all of the presents without touching anything that they've opened. So some years it has taken us the whole day to open Christmas presents, which frustrates my in-laws to no end because they are here for like 2 hours and they want to see every present opened because they want to see whether or not that present was something the kids enjoyed. And that's sort of a like a conflicting need, right? The grandparents want to see the kids open every present. The kids cannot possibly open every present because they're just not there. They're just not going to do it because they miss out on the fun of opening that new toy and playing with it. And that was a really hard switch to make for some folks. The grandparents were just like, no, we really want to see everything. As the kids have gotten older and the presents have gotten a little less exciting, it's gotten easier to open everything. But for a long time there, it was sometimes a couple of days to get everything open because I just really was not going to force the issue and I wasn't going to force them to rush through everything, which the grandparents have all found very frustrating. They get it now, years later, but to get to that point was really hard for them. So I think that's the important thing, right? Figure out how you're going to share holidays, how you're going to share traditions, and how you're going to build your own traditions. What are the traditions that your family wants to have, your household wants to have? What are the things that matter to you, and what are the things that make sense for the children in your household, rather than focusing on what the adults have always done? That flexibility is really key, and that discussion matters, because knowing what's important is what gives you the opportunity to actually sort out what you absolutely must do versus what just seems nice to do or what has been done before. And I really feel like that's where people lose track of what's important. The kids are always the most important. Doing things as a family is probably second most to me. And third is respecting the needs of everybody involved to make sure that you're not doing something that causes suffering in the pursuit of family togetherness. If you don't see eye to eye on these things, consider going to counseling. Really. If you can't figure it out amongst yourselves, go to counseling, get a counselor, have somebody help mediate that discussion. Do it now rather than waiting until after you have kids and after you've had things come apart at the seams. Do it before you end up getting divorced. And I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but not really, because I've My parents didn't get divorced until I was in my 30s. And my first question to my mom was, why did you wait so long? And, sort those things out before they are a problem for your kids is always my first advice. That's not your kid's problem. The fact that you don't agree about what to do about Christmas is not your kid's problem. And frankly, it should never be something that they know about as little kids. Go to counseling, get some negotiation skills, learn to compromise. And if it's not something that you can compromise on, or the other person isn't willing to compromise, then have a serious discussion with yourself about why you're in this relationship. Right? Because it is not worth everybody being miserable, and it is not worth the ongoing fights that escalate over things like this. The goal has to be, what's the right thing to do for the kids? Right? And taking away the fun of holidays because the parents are not able to get along is not what's in their best interest. So with that, I encourage you to think about your holidays and your practices. Have some honest conversations about what things matter to each of you. Remember that those things that matter can change over time, and agree to come back and talk about it more when something has changed. Talk about it if something doesn't seem to be working, or if there are things that you've agreed to that aren't really working for you anymore. Or if there are things that aren't working for your kids, right? Everybody's input matters. And everybody's end result matters. At least as far as I'm concerned. If it's not working for your kids, then it's not really working for all of you, and you should figure that out. All right. So, as always, pop over to our website, paganparentingpodcast.com. Let us know what you think. Let us know what else we should talk about. We're always looking for advertisers. So if you are looking to reach pagan parents in your business, let's chat. And with that, we'll talk to you next time. That's it for this episode. This is just a reminder that you can find Pagan Parenting Podcast on Facebook. And you can check out our website, paganparentingpodcast.com, for links to all of the podcast sites that we're on and to our support link. The Pagan Parenting Podcast is a production of the Spiral Moon Media Group for Spiral Moon Family Circle. You can find out more at spiralmoon.org. We'll talk more soon.